Okay, my first question to Dr. Joseph. How did you get into teaching?
Well, I guess it's a long story. I mean, I,
Go for it, please. Stories are good for podcasts.
well, I always, I mean, I think even as a kid, I liked teaching. In high school, I tutored kids and students in my high school in various academic subjects, and then I wanted to go after college. I wanted to get a PhD, and decided that I was going to get it. So I went to Harvard for undergraduate, and then I went to get a PhD in Chicago, University of Chicago. And my father, right, it coincided with my father getting sick with Lou Gehrig's disease, and I had to sort of take, part of the process with that was involved taking care of him, and I wanted to get as much time as possible to take care of my dad, and I decided to drop out to leave the PhD program and to take care of him. And one of the few opportunities that was available for someone if they wanted to actually have a job at the time was to do tutoring. And so I tutored with some of the bigger organizations, the bigger tutoring companies, now the companies with which we're in competition. But I started working with Kaplan and Princeton Review and some of the places here in Chicago just to kind of make some extra money and to do something that I had always liked doing, which was teaching. And in the process, learned about the ACT and SAT and some of the methods that we've come to use now, many years later, and found myself really enjoying it. And I started a practice. I wound up starting my own practice after I worked at Princeton Review and at Kaplan for a few years. Very small practice and one-on-one students, just intensive work with individuals, and found that a large part of the work that I was doing, because I really enjoyed the teaching a lot, but I found that a large part of what we were doing involved ACT, SAT, because as much as students needed academic coursework, they really benefit, especially from ACT, SAT, because those tests are tests that they don't really prepare you for and that are really not super reflective of what students learn in high school. And so I started my own practice, kind of developed into in large part a service that a one-on-one service in which I was privately working with many people here in Chicago in on ACT, SAT, and college essays. And then I went off to get my PhD and went back to Harvard, and I got my PhD in sociology. And while I was there, again, found myself gravitating toward teaching. I taught. I was a teacher. I was a teaching fellow, and I taught a number of students at Harvard in classes. And when I was decided to do my PhD research, I decided I was going to come back to Chicago to do my ethnographic research in Chicago on the South Side. And again, found myself revisiting, re-engaging with the ACT and SAT world, because again, finding that I wanted to have some work that I was doing that would supplement the work that I was doing, the more solitary experience of working with students of doing my PhD research. I came back to working with kids in ACT, SAT, and couple that with some disillusionment about academia and the realization that that in academia you're not really rewarded for your teaching. You're not really rewarded for the actual engagement that you have with students. You're rewarded for other things, a lot of which have to do with politics and with adherence to certain kind of methodological expectations in the field, and discovered that I really love working with kids directly. And after I got my PhD done, expanded this business, this personal business, this private practice, which had reemerged in the time that I'd been in graduate school, and decided that as things were getting bigger and I was getting more of a caseload and more students were coming in, that it started as an actual business with a company name and a website, and with people who could tutor with me alongside me. Because another thing that I realized in doing this with students, we're working through the college process, working through academic coursework, working through, the college applications, right? The college essays, the college selection, was that there were certain things I was really good at, but there were certain things I just wasn't very good at. Like I didn't really know how to, on the ACT, SAT, for example, like, my students were getting 12 points on the ACT English, and they were only getting like a couple of points on the ACT Science. They were making a lot of progress on the SAT Writing and Language, but there were certain areas where I hadn't really cracked the code. And one of the things about this process is that we're very data driven, and we have all of this data, and I went through 26,000 questions from official exams, ACTs and SATs, to examine sort of every imaginable variable. But even with all of this data, discovered that I wasn't, I was really strong. I was very good at English. I put myself, I think I'm as good at English as anybody anywhere, in teaching English, ACT or SAT, writing. But like I need a team. Like I need a team because we just as in the process of working with students, our project involves helping students leverage their strengths to cover their weaknesses or compensate for the weaknesses or to improve their weaknesses. Similarly, as teachers or as coaches, having a good team of people with whom we could work would help me leverage my strengths and cover my weaknesses. And so that's where, I hired people like Andrew and Joe Burton and Cameron Gong, and we started developing a real team, and we love it. I mean, I think we love it. We specialize. Most of our students see us for particular areas, and then they see other top tutors for other areas. So they are really kind of super scoring us on these tests and on the college process. They're taking the best qualities that we have, and in turn, we are working with students to help do the same thing for them. We're helping to leverage their strengths and helping them discover talents that they never even knew existed. So we're helping students with these tests, but we're also helping them learn real skills, like learn academic skills and intellectual skills, helping them develop like analytical ways of thinking. I mean, a lot of these tests are organized around, learning how to read quickly under pressure, or learning how to synthesize a lot of information very quickly and really make sense of it and distill it in a way that's effective. And teaching students how to do that, I found to be extremely rewarding. And there's no better feeling really than the experience of watching and working with somebody who doesn't have who comes in without the confidence that they're going to be that they'll know it, that they know what to do. It comes in with a fear of tests or anxiety about tests, and helping them demystify this process. And so suddenly having them have that moment, it's more than an aha moment. It's more gradual than that. So it's not so much of an epiphany or sort of some galvanic recognition, but it is very often this period of time where they come to realize like how smart they are, and how these things that they thought had been impenetrable are actually really things that not only that they can understand and make use of, but that they actually can come to enjoy. And that's what education, I think, is about. It's about taking things that, Nietzsche has this quote about becoming who you are, helping students become, who they are, helping them discover things within themselves that they didn't know they had. I think that's the part of it that I find most gratifying, and that's what has, in large part, what has enabled me to persist. Has helped us push through this process and get bigger and develop more relationships with more students and get better at what we're doing and help students get better at what they're doing too.
Got it, Dr. Joseph. It's pretty interesting because I thought, whatever you think that you're doing is better suited to do at the academia level than at the test prep, but it's interesting that you're doing it at the test prep scenario, which is great. I'll come back to it.
It's not so fundamentally different. I mean, it's not so different in a couple of ways. I mean, one way which is not so different is that, when you're doing research for these tests, you're doing it. Number one is you're doing it inductively. So you're looking at the new SAT, you're looking at the ACT, and you're trying to find patterns, right? You're trying to find patterns in the ways that the questions are being framed. You're trying to find patterns in the ways in which the answers are being framed, which verbs come up most frequently in the reading. For the right answers, is it who or whom for the English? And you're running data analysis, and that's just as academic sociology or quantitative social science is organized around, ideally, at least not, it isn't always in practice organized this way, unfortunately, around a kind of inductive mode of analysis. Similarly, we're trying to do the same thing here to try to learn what these tests, to try to determine what these tests are like, and there's a similar use of data, and there's also the same sort of excitement that we find when we see these patterns. And then putting them into practice is a little bit different. It's more of a policy application, more of a work in which we're actually working hands-on than it would be with academia. But a lot of the research is not so fundamentally different, I think.
Awesome, to say the least. Andrew, what about you? I mean, how did you get into teaching?
Yeah, so it probably started for me in high school. I was the one who found myself helping several of my friends with their AB calculus homework. My mom actually used to listen to me help them at our kitchen table, and
Sorry,
she would
did you both go to school together or something? I'm just
no,
setting. Okay.
No,
yeah,
that's very
I'm
flattering.
from
Andrew could almost be my, well, not quite son, but like close, younger brother.
yes.
Got it.
Um,
Nice.
so yeah, I in a small suburb of Milwaukee, I would help a lot of my friends with their AB calculus homework. And my mom used to listen to me, and she used to just mildly hint. She'd like, Andrew, you're not bad at that. You should look at kind of tutoring as a side gig. It might be a good way to make some money in college. And she could tell I enjoyed it. And simultaneously, I found that it helped my grades a lot. It sounds cliche, but teaching the material actually helped me learn it quite well, actually, answering this question from this perspective. Then you had someone else ask it a slightly different way, so you had to come up with a slightly different explanation for it. It forced me to think about problems from a variety of approaches. And when you're talking with 20 different students explaining the same math problem, there's times where you're actually explaining it 20 different ways. And so I think that's part of what helped. I then went to college. I kept tutoring because, like every college student, I needed some money. And so I did some after-school programs and stuff like that, some group work. So I did that all through undergrad up at Loyola Chicago, where I was doing political science and philosophy. Nothing math related, though I was primarily tutoring math. I then went on to University of Chicago for my master's. I didn't do as much tutoring there. They kind of put us through the ringer in that program, so I took about a year off of tutoring. Um, and then I immediately hopped back into tutoring after that when I started my PhD at University of Illinois Chicago in political science, focusing on political theory. And I think I can share this now, that my very first meeting with anyone in the department, I was actually effectively told, hey, why are you in this program? Like, what's the point of you doing this? And I was a little upset, I'll be honest. But I did appreciate the honesty, and he became my advisor and probably my most trusted professor at that school, actually. And I ended up really appreciating what he said and thinking about it for really the next 4 years that I worked towards that degree. They put me they put me as a TA for, at one time, over half of the political science students at the school. No one had ever TA'd for that many students at once, and I felt it. They eventually then gave me my own class to teach American politics and government, also something that I don't think had ever been done before for someone who had not done their qualifying exams. And they didn't even look at my syllabus. I think to this day, no one's ever seen the syllabus that I taught for that class. They kind of gave me full freedom because in part I think they wanted to see, hey, do you want to teach? Is this good? Because the plan always was to go get my PhD in political theory, become a professor at a university, and just go from there. I had never really wavered from that for quite a while. And I kept tutoring on the side. I was doing the in-home tutoring, which was definitely not easy or fun. But throughout that time, I was being pulled in kind of two different directions. I was a tutor at that time for about 6 different companies, managing different ways of tracking hours and billing and getting tutor assignments. Every company has their different methods, some better than others. I tried some of these online gigs with the apps. I basically had seen every model that existed at the time in terms of how to, and worked for it, under it, for how a tutoring company could be structured. And at the same time trying to finish my PhD. There came a breaking point when I taught my first class. As fun as it was, there were some good moments. I came out of that class basically saying, you know what, this isn't really for me. I did not get nearly as much out of teaching a class as sitting down with a student one-on-one, and working through things very slowly. What annoyed me about the class, I think, and I don't think it's something I could have gotten over, is I knew that there were always going to be those handful of students in the back of the room that no matter how I said it, they weren't going to pick up on what I was saying, not because they weren't capable of it, but because they just didn't care to. Like, they were clearly in the class just to get the credits and fill the time. And I can't blame them for that. I did plenty of that myself in undergraduate, but as an instructor, I couldn't quite get past that personally. I didn't like that, and I have some perfectionistic qualities that got in the way there. And so I ended up being hyper-focused on those students, and I realized, with tutoring, once I realized a student, right, isn't in it, usually with tutoring, for the most part, you get kids who kind of want to learn and grow and do better and I could kind of narrow in on those cases and not really have to worry about what was going on with a classroom of students. So I think the ultimate change came down to just the difference in rewards that I got from teaching a class versus teaching one-on-one. I was asked last year, I think, by one of my students my favorite part of tutoring, and it was I often aim for the big that comment from students, like once they finally see something and it clicks. That you never get that from a class, even if a kid's thinking it. They don't say it out loud. You don't get that type of feedback or reinforcement, and so I think that's kind of what drew me in. And then, what was it, that fateful day 5 years ago? I interviewed for Dr. Krupnick here, and I started out, I don't remember what subjects. I was maybe doing all the subjects, but I very quickly moved into just math tutoring. And it was most of what I had been doing prior as well, which is somewhat ironic because I did not, maybe I shouldn't say this, I've never taken a college math course. I tested out of them, and then went on to major in philosophy and political science. And so I find myself kind of traversing a weird gap where all my tests in school said I should go on and be an engineer or something like that. And I went the philosophy route. But as Plato said, you shouldn't be allowed to study philosophy before you have like 20 years of math education. And so that's kind of where I landed, and I haven't turned back since. I kind of I was also being told that my desired dissertation topic, which is died out in the 70s. No one's really interested in it anymore, and they were honest with me and basically told me as much. And so that kind of sealed the deal for me, and I said, you know what, I really like the tutoring. Let's go all in on that. And if I want a PhD down the road in whatever, or I want a culinary degree in 20 years, then I go do that. But now I'm really, really enjoying the tutoring.
Got it, Andrew. Dr. Joseph, I'm going to come back to you. I was, the Krupnick approach. How you started teaching, way before you kind of put together the Krupnick approach in a structured or a formal manner like an organization. But I was, going through the website and I was just wondering, okay, what's the Krupnick approach? And it sort of had a very definitive four process thing, starting off with executive functioning, if I'm not wrong. So my question to you is, how did you arrive at that approach? A definitive approach.
Well, it's an interesting question. A lot of yeah, I talk with parents a lot about that, and I think that I often find myself backpedaling because there's something misleading about the term Krupnick approach. It's a sort of a self-aggrandizing idea in itself, right? That it is my approach, right? That it's an approach organized around me, or that it's an approach that I invented, or that someone named Krupnick, maybe it's not me, someone else named Krupnick invented it, right? But it's not that at all. I mean, so I think one thing that's important to say up front and to express is that it's an approach that is very collaborative, and that has been collaborative from the beginning, since the day that perhaps infelicitous name was created. That we rely entirely on the viewpoints, the strengths, the particular ways of thinking of our tutors, and we allow those ideas, those ways of thinking, those skills, those approaches, those techniques of each of our tutors, especially Andrew and a few of our other top tutors, to guide how we think about these tests. And so there's a kind of cross-pollination. It's a cross-pollination not just in the way that we approach our students, but in the way that we even think about these subjects ourselves. So we've learned a lot from each other. So we've learned about how to teach the material from each other. We've learned, the old saying about you learn as much from your students as the students learn from you. I mean, as it turns out to be true. So we learned, I think, at least in my case, I've learned probably as much from my students about how to teach and how to think about some of the things the material that we cover, as our students have. But if to answer the question in a slightly more direct way, what it really is, I think, what distinguishes us from other services, because there are a lot of places where you can go and get ACT prep, or you study for an academic course, or you prepare for college. But there are a few things that are really distinctive about the way that we do our work, and I think it's really important. I mean, I think one thing is that we start from the point of departure that these tests are not especially reflections of what students have learned in school, and to a certain extent they are. Like the math section that Andrew does really is shaped in part, at least, by what the course you're taking in school. But there are two really big differences. Like one difference is that in school, if you're good at most schools at least, you are excavating beneath the surface. You're looking for metaphors and imagery and subtext and figurative language, and there's very much of an emphasis on thinking and critical reasoning and inward orientation, and creativity, even in some senses. I mean, trying to understand why the Pythagorean theorem, is the way it is. And on the ACT and SAT, at least, there's much more. It's much more of an outward orientation. I mean, sometimes I talk about the single most important variable in doing well on these tests is knowing what to pay attention to and what's a distraction. So much of it involves recognizing what the question is asking in the first place. And you can't afford to think too deeply, because if you think too deeply, you'll fall into a rabbit hole. You'll start second guessing yourself. You'll start getting coaxed into a wrong answer, or you'll get lulled into a false sense of security. And that's one big difference. I mean, no teacher would ever write a test that they've designed for students not to finish. Even the worst teachers in the world would never do that. Whereas, on the ACT, you have an 80-minute test that in science, the ACT science is, essentially an 80-minute test that they only give you 35 minutes to finish. The reading is a 70-minute test that they only give you 35 minutes to finish. We have a student who's at Northwestern. Her father's a physics professor at Northwestern, and he had come in a number of years ago now, and he wanted to see what the ACT science was like, and he took it, and he's a professor of physics at Northwestern, tenured professor. He's told me I can tell this story, so I think it's okay for the public.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
He got a 22 on the ACT science, professor of physics at Northwestern. So that gives us some sense, and I think that the most of the services out there, especially for test prep, are really organized around simply teaching this as a kind of adjunct to what students are learning in school. Which is not to say that it doesn't. I mean, we teach the content. I mean, Andrew's the best at that. He teaches the content, and he teaches the content in ways that students wouldn't have been able to learn it, from their classroom teachers, or in ways that they didn't learn it from their classroom teachers. But there's this additional element involving knowing how the test is organized. And so this in part means that we've been very data driven, I've gone through 26,000 questions, 18,000 ACT questions, 8,000 SAT questions, and we have all of these official tests. And knowing what the test is like, I mean, sort of like Billy Beane, not to be self-aggrandizing, right? But the old Moneyball approach, right? Like the Moneyball approach is what is baseball statistics. Baseball was always governed by a world in which people would rosters would be chosen on the basis of what a player looked like when they were pitching, or whether they could how fast they were running. But the revolution was a statistical revolution, to discover that you could actually model these things statistically, and you can model these questions statistically too, and that's what we've done. We've modeled them statistically in a way that nobody else has ever done before, and we found that there are these categories of rules, and there are categories of rules for these tests that nobody has really covered and nobody has really been aware of. We call them test-specific rules or magic tricks, content-related rules, and then the thing that emerges in the third thing, which is really what remains after you've covered these first two, are the customized rules. And the customized rules are based on, we were talking about around, that we've been doing this for 20 years, or we've been tutoring for 15 years, and that every student is going to have a slightly different orientation of these exams. But the test-specific rules are really amazing. I mean, it turns out that if you have an English question on the ACT or SAT, and you have 3 singular answers and 1 plural answer, the answer is always going to be plural. The answer, if you have 3 plural and 1 singular, it's always going to be singular. 3 to 5 questions on any given ACT English are organized around that 3-in-1 rule. 2 questions on any given digital SAT are. So if you have represented, represent, are representing, and represents with an S, it's always going to be represents with an S, because it's the only singular answer among those 4 possibilities. And so there are a lot of other rules like this too. The context delete rule, where you have a moreover, nevertheless, for example, for instance, you have the option just to delete the first word, you always can. If they ask you whether to revise something and the revision makes it more specific, it's yes. If it makes it less specific, it's no. If you have 2 answers in reading and one of them is like everyone's walking out of the room and everyone's saying, I got 2 answers that are really close. What did you guys choose? What did you guys pick between A and C on question 21? And one of the answers is often like, many people like ice cream, and the other one is like, most people like ice cream. Well, the answer is always going to be many people, because if most people like ice cream, it's also true that many people do, and you can't have 2 answers that are simultaneously correct, on a multiple choice test. So, and this comes up all the time. And so if you're choosing between many and most, or it's always many. If it's humans versus men, it's always going to be humans, because all men are humans, but not all humans are men. So that's very important, like that data-driven quality. I mean, you could look up these rules on the internet, and none of them exist on the internet. Most of the people who do test prep or work with students on these sorts of things, are first-year graduate students. And we were both first-year graduate students, and we were teaching these tests one day, but we aren't anymore. And so we know these tests in a way that maybe someone somewhere in a lab, at Kaplan or Princeton Review knows these tests like that, but they are not disseminating these rules to the tutors. They are keeping them somewhere, because if they disseminated those rules to the tutors would, at $20 an hour or $30, whatever, would take off and start their own business or do something with them. We've created these rules together. Joe Burton, one of our top reading tutors, has come up with a rule where if you know where in the passage the answer to a question is on an ACT reading question, you will know where in the passage the answer to the next question is. It's like a formula. where if you know where the line was from the question that you just did, you'll know within about a 10-line block where the answer to the next question is, which is an incredible thing, as opposed to having to look through all 90 lines. So it saves a tremendous amount of time. That's a big edge. And I've already talked a little while, so I won't talk too much longer. But there are a couple of other sort of advantages. I mean, I think one advantage is that is this specialist model of teaching. That we have the best. I mean, it's this is a qualitative thing. It's subjective. Obviously, I'm biased in saying this, but we have the best. We have the best tutors. The time and energy that's gone into finding our tutors we spent hundreds, thousands of hours on figuring out who the right tutors should be, how to hire them, what the right approaches should be for how they can be most effective, and of course with their tremendous amount of collaboration and input on that, and matching them with students. And that's something that most tutoring companies don't really do at all. And knowing here that like when I was getting my PhD, I realized that, as I said, I mean, we were talking about this, that I mean, I was teaching English and everybody was getting 10 points, 12 points, 14 points. Teaching science and people weren't able to get the same kinds of gains. I mean, I just wasn't very good at teaching the science. And so it's sort of the same reason this actually is sort of like school, where it's the same reason that you wouldn't want your English teacher in school teaching your science class. And I think these tests are similar, that in that way, that they each have different governing principles. Each section has a different set of governing principles. And so we are specialists. Andrew spends 50 hours a week working with students on math, on ACT and SAT math. So he knows those questions better than anyone possibly could, unless they were doing math all day long. And and I do English like that, and Cameron Gong does science like that, and Joe Burton does reading like that, and Marcy Fraser is an expert in essays. And we all have our own frame. Now we of course dip into others a little bit, but that's very unusual. I mean, specialists. I mean, it's not only that we're working one-on-one, it's that the faculty to student ratio is actually 3-to-1 or 2-to-1. You have more faculty than you have students. And so they're leveraging our strengths. They are super scoring us. That's, I think, another big additional thing for us. The other thing, just really briefly, is that most companies that do test prep, and that's it. They do test prep, and they don't necessarily do test prep that well, but they do test prep, ACT and SAT. Well, we are a fully integrated college prep service in which we work with students on test prep, we work with students on academic coursework, we work with students on college prep, on college selection, on college essays, on recommendation materials. So we have this life course model in which a number of our students will start at very, very young ages. I mean, in some cases, Andrew, for example, has been working with some students who started with when they were like 4 or 5 years old, 6 years old.
Wow.
And they go through the whole process, right? And that's a way to really get to know students well, and for them to get to know us well. Because as much data as you can collect, as much of this that is scientific and data-driven and Moneyball-ish and Bill Bean-ish and statistical, there's a fundamental part of it which is ineffable and based really on the relationship that students have with teachers. And that is inviolable, and that's the sort of thing that when you're working with a student over a long period of time, working with a tutor over a long period of time, you really get to know them. And getting to know them and already knowing them when they're starting the college process is crucial. When you're doing ACT, SAT, you're doing academic, and then you start working with someone in a college process, you have an enormous advantage in helping them with their college thinking, with their essays, with the conversations with their parents about financial aid or about which kind of colleges they're better served for, engineering or math or whatever, than you would be if you just walked in cold. And so just as colleges employ this equivocating, sort of vague term, which, holistic admissions, in which they're looking at the student as a whole person, that's kind of how we think about it too. We don't want to truncate the student and just treat the student as a test score. That you're accepted not based on the individual pieces of your profile. Like, it's not just the sum of the parts. They look at you as a whole person, and they integrate the ways in which the different parts of who you are kind of integrate together. just as important on the same side for the other side for students to make these decisions based on themselves and the colleges as a whole, rather than just based on individual characteristics by themselves. And I think those are three big things. The data-driven part of it, the fact that we work as specialists and that we have tutors who are really, really good and just are passionate about this and whose life's commitment is devoted to working with students and loving working with students. And then this sort of life course, fully integrated model, which we take students all the way through. And sometimes we even take students all the way through to graduate school. We work with students on the LSAT, or we have students we've worked with in the ACT, SAT, and then we work with them on the GMAT. And so those are three big elements of the Krupnick approach, which defy the language of any individual cult of personality or anything, but are really about the team. I mean, the whole thing is about the collaboration among each other and collaboration with the students. So, approach, yes. Krupnick, no. Approach, yes, absolutely.
Wow. Dr. Joseph, you said a lot of those, the data that you've collected, the patterns that you've seen. You said a few, 5 to 6 or 7. How many of them are there in all? What's the total number of such patterns that you've identified?
Well, some of us we won't disagree on the exact number. And what constitutes what we call these test-specific rules or magic tricks. These are questions that you can do automatically simply based on the way the test is designed, simply based on the internal mechanics of the test. And we debate about how many of those are. In my experience, there are about 20% of the questions on the ACT you can do automatically just based on the way that the test is designed. It's a little bit less than that on the SAT. We're like 14% probably on the SAT. But partly I think what it depends on is your notion of how reliable is a rule like this. So for example, on the ACT, there have been, I think, 180 questions that I've asked about the difference between who and whom over the last 20 years. And on 179 of those 180 questions, the correct answer has been who, WHO. Now, so if you're choosing between who and who, you choose who. But is that a magic trick? Well, that's very tricky, because why is it who? I don't know. It's a little bit arbitrary, right? So if you tell a really good student, always choose who or whom, what happens if that language changes? What happens if the rule changes? So we're constantly updating this based on the models that we use. But it can change, and so we have to be somewhat careful about what we call a magic trick and what we don't call a magic trick. And I think there are far fewer rules like this in math than there are in say, in English or in reading. In math, you have formulas that you're going to need to know from school, and that's where the combination of these different kinds of rules becomes so important.
Got it, Dr. Joseph. Before I move on to Andrew, just one question. You spoke about how you spend so much time finding the right tutor. What's the story behind finding Andrew? How did that happen? I was going to ask Andrew, how did he land up at the Krupnick approach? But I want to hear it from you as a person who hired him. What was the story behind it?
Well, I could come up with a Hollywood story that would start, I don't know, Ryan Gosling and Josh Hartnett or I don't know, somewhat. But it wouldn't really. It's not a Hollywood story. I mean, these things happen as they do, like very prosaically. Like how do you meet your wife? It's usually not that it came in January on New Year's Day when everybody was throwing was singing or whatever. I believe that we were looking for tutors, and my wife Emily Krupnick, who's an important part of the team, chief management officer, she came across Andrew on some listing somewhere. He was doing tutoring, and we brought him in, and he knew because he was in Chicago, and this was before the pandemic, and we started talking with Andrew about what Andrew could do and what his experience was and what his hours he was looking for might be and how much experience he's had. And I was extremely impressed for a lot of reasons. I think the thing that was most incredible and continues to be even amaze me more, because Andrew is unlike a lot of people. You meet them. I mean, Andrew made a great first impression. Don't get me wrong, but there are a lot. I mean, the most of the people who make great first impressions, your opinion of them sort of gradually gets worse. With Andrew made a great first impression, and as I've gotten to know Andrew better, I've just been more and more amazed, like more and more, like admiring, appreciative, and you know, and just impressed. And I mean, first of all, I mean, I think it's that Andrew talks about this work as he's doing it here with a kind of seriousness and a kind of commitment and a kind of love and a kind of energy that is extraordinarily unusual in any profession. That you know, that he really knows how important it is, you know, the work that he's doing, and how important it is to the students, how important it is to him, to work with students, and how important it is for students to be learning these things. I mean, we share a little bit of pessimism about American education, and we share a similar philosophy about the kinds of things that are important in education, like learning how to think, and learning how to think analytically, and learning how to disagree. And I think that's another thing, is that I immediately realized that you know, there are tutors who they're people in general, you know, you hire them and they just do an interview and they just kind of like they make you feel better about yourself, and they make you feel like you're right. You know, Andrew is always going to give you his opinion, and his opinion is usually going to be right, even if your opinion is wrong. And that's one of his best qualities. I mean, one of the best qualities of Andrew, and I met him right at the beginning. I mean, I was like, this is some of the ideas that we have are this, and he was like, oh, you know, you might try to think about it a little bit differently. You might try this kind of approach, and you know, I'm going to do this now, but I'm also going to, you know, I'm not going to lose my personality. You know, this is going to be. Andrew was going to teach the material in the way that he knew how to do, and he had a lot of advice for how we might do things differently, because there were a lot of ways in which we did then and we continue to do now things that I do, or at least I do things, not we, but that could use a great deal of, you know, that are not the right ideas, right? That are not the right, that could be changed. Andrew always is very, very, very capable of. I mean, whatever. It's not capable. Andrew's just you know what. This kind of autonomy in the sense of like he knows what it is that he thinks, you know, makes for something that works, and something that doesn't work, makes for great spirited arguments, and very often it's Andrew who turns out to be right about these things, and I turn out to be wrong about these things in the long run, which is always kind of frustrating. But yeah, I mean, that's the sort of the trajectory. And I think, as I said, Andrew just getting just better and better and better. I didn't know, like, for example, the extent to which Andrew is so gifted at the things that I am just terrible at. You know, like, I'm terrible at a lot of the things involving executive functioning and administrative work. I mean, I shouldn't even say that, really. But, like, Andrew is the executive functioning coach for everyone in this whole organization. I mean, Andrew could be the executive functioning for the country. Coach for the country. I mean, he's just, and it's not, and I don't say that because it's like something that he wants to do, he feels obligated. It's just like something that it's just naturally an incredible gift. And so when we discovered that more and more, it was like, wow, we have this incredible complementarity. That there are things that I couldn't do if I had a million years. I couldn't do some of the things that, you know, organizing the way that the structure of this company operates. I couldn't do in a million years, the things that he could sometimes just think about intuitively and do on the spot. So, yeah.
Got it, Dr. Joseph.
Very, very, very fortunate. We're all very fortunate. Kids are very fortunate. I'm very fortunate. We are very fortunate. The team is very fortunate.
Awesome stuff.
Nice.
Well, I mean, look, you know, sometimes we don't agree, and sometimes I still arrive at the idea that I'm right, and sometimes I probably am, but you know, you need to have, but the point is that that's not the world we want to live in. We don't want to live in a world in which we all agree. We We want to live in a world in which, and I'm not saying that Andrew's argumentative. What I'm saying is that it's the goal here is not agreement. I mean, it's agreement maybe in the sense of agreeing after we've debated. If the goal is truth, the goal is coming up with something that works. That's always the goal. It always should be the goal. And that's the way that we work together with that spirit in mind.
Agreeing to disagree sometimes, or most times.
Yeah, and then usually eventually you agree because you see that you see that
for the greater good.
Evidence comes to bear. But right.
Great stuff. Andrew, you spoke about why tutoring. That's always a question, but I don't have to ask you the question because you've already answered that for me. Given that you're doing tutoring not just because there is tutoring and you don't have anything else to do. You've actually explored a lot of things, and then you've zeroed down on tutoring because that's what you want to do. You like it, and you want that moments from your students and stuff like that. Given that mindset, how much research did you do what Krupnick Approach was when you joined them? Because it must have been a big deal for you to where you joined and worked.
Well, also to kind of pair or to kind of meet up with what Dr. Krupnick was saying, and I'll return some of the compliment as well. When shortly after I met Dr. Krupnick, I went and I bought a computer that I could not afford at the time. And I said, look, I just met this guy. He's got this model of, because he had already been talking about the specialist model, and just to kind of touch on that specialist model from the tutor's perspective, it's difficult at first, and something that right, he described his process of realizing his students were getting high scores on English, but maybe not so much on the science. Right, and I will say, having come from kind of the rat race of independent contractor tutoring for all these different companies at once, every tutor thinks that they're experts at every single subject. And so you won't meet a tutor who's working for a variety of companies who they'll resist the question of whether or not they are good at or better at some subjects than others, right? Because they want to say that they can do the entire test. And I will say I went through that kind of transition of having to say to myself, you know what? No, that's not true. I do I do better here and worse there. I do better with these types of students and not so much with these types of students. And so he brought me on board, and it was hesitant at first. I had the same resistance, I think, that a lot of tutors do. He might not even know that. But he kind of brought me on board, and as I saw that, and as I started to work just more on the math, at first a lot of math and science, but then even more math, I started to get really excited by it, actually, and I went out and I invested in a computer that I have to this day that, again, like I said, I could not afford at the time, but I'm like, you know what, this is a great opportunity. And so I didn't know, admittedly, I didn't know much going in about the Krupnick approach or how Joe structured it, but the more I learned, the kind of more excited I got, the more I got kind of pulled away, frankly, from my work in school, and it became less and less appealing to me. I'll also say I think it's pretty rare, and I'm pretty lucky to have a boss that does put up with what he graciously described as an autonomous spirit. So he's very open and takes criticism well, certainly better than I. And so that helps a lot. Because I get that from my mother. I think that you will always kind of know how we think. And just to touch on why I think in the end he was right about all that, despite my resistance at first. I mean, I was sitting here listening to him, and had I been tutoring all subjects this entire time, I can guarantee that my overall performance in each one would be significantly lower than any individual than I can get now. So, for example, I work with so many students on math that at this point I know not only how their schools, because I work with so many kids from one school, I know how their school approaches these math topics. I can almost predict based on the school that they're at and what math track that they're in, how they're going to approach a given topic. So for example, simplifying radicals. I know which schools are going to use the prime factorization, and I know which are going to use, excuse me, and I know which schools are going to use perfect squares. And so by narrowing in and focusing on an individual subject, I've been able to recognize the exact types of patterns that Dr. Krupnick describes in English, but in math, although they are far looser, I think, and harder to formalize. So for example, the distance formula. I go on rant against the distance formula with all of my students because I say, right, in school, they're just giving you the distance formula so that they don't have to teach you the proper application of the Pythagorean theorem, because that's all it is a more complicated version of the Pythagorean theorem. And so a combination of just focusing on math for so many years now, plus a lot of academic work with these students, actually, which I think maybe other tutors in other subjects don't necessarily get that benefit because there's just less tutoring done in the Englishes and history and science. Maybe that's not true for science, but because I work with so many students on academic math, I know how their schools are teaching these topics. I then am keeping up with the changing rules for the ACT, and I'm able to bridge those two things. Because I can look at a student and most of the time guess what they put for if they got a question wrong. And that's in part because I know their school curriculum so well. So that type of hyper focus on one subject, I think in the end, is what really, though I was resistant at first, I certainly was convinced relatively quickly, and I think it's paid off now tenfold. So that's kind of, I didn't, circle back to your question, I didn't know a whole lot. I had to be brought on certain aspects, but he certainly made a believer out of me relatively quickly.
Got it, Andrew. We know one of those aspects is, the specialist model, you just stick to one subject and, teach. But on a lighter note, how, specific would you go? I mean, have you gone specific beyond the subject? Like, Dr. Joseph, have you explored, okay, how about one tutor just focus on algebra and one on arithmetic? Have you gone down to that level as well?
Yeah, that's a really that's a really interesting question, and it's a tricky one because I think that we've done that. It's kind of like the holistic model of education now, right? Where it's like, or like the integrated approach that, on the one hand, we want to get these things boiled down to their essence, right? We want to be able to get this as scientifically and empirically defensive, unimpeachable and testable and correct as possible. But on the other hand, there's certain things that are not, there's a part of the world that is not quite so, that can't really be, where you can't really be quite so reductive. So some of the questions we debate all the time about, are they really algebra questions, are they really geometry questions, right? I mean, is a slope question, is a y equals mx plus b question, is that really algebra or is it geometry? I suppose it depends on, it depends on what your definition of these things are. If it's a matter of presentation, and maybe it's a geometry question, but on the other hand, you're using algebra. So there is something, I think, that to be said for really that kind of granularity and that kind of specific sort of Adam Smith kind of level of division of labor, but like a division of specialization. But yeah, I think that we always have to be careful of that because so many of these questions can be categorized in so many different ways. Like we categorize these questions, and you actually go through them and you tag them along all the different lines in which they possibly can be. It often gets extremely complicated and extremely muddled. So that's the part where I think like the customized approach becomes so important. Where Andrew might teach a particular question in a way that you might that in a way that might be a little bit different from the way a traditional algebra teacher would teach it. That might use some different somewhere else. The other thing that's actually important about that is that this idea of really optimizing or making use of student strengths, that some students who are, like, I was always very bad in geometry as a kid. Like I was very good in math and really just could never really make sense of, like, I was just, best in organization, just couldn't draw on anything. How do you actually draw a three-dimensional object? I mean, it's never really been something I've ever been able to
Yeah,
draw.
yeah.
Even
The
on
conic
Zoom.
sections and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, like, there's another part of this too, which is to say, okay, yeah, that's geometry, sure, right? But, you can teach that stuff sort of algebraically. I mean, Plato may have said, "Let no man who's ignorant of geometry enter here into the academy." But, what is geometry, really? I mean, geometry is sort of the foundations of well, I mean, geometry and algebra very foundationally are not so dissimilar. So I think that's one answer for you. That, like, yes, we do absolutely, though. I mean, to be less facile about some of these answers, like, it is definitely the case that some of our tutors really do better with, sort of less sort of with students who are struggling a little bit more. Some of our students do better with students who are struggling a little bit more in algebra. Like, for example, with like clauses in English. One of the things I've noticed is that, like, if people can follow the rules, like, I have a strategy file that I can go around charging $30,000 an hour for it, and kids can get 35 in English if they can apply the rules and they can just memorize the rules. But there's one thing that is very difficult, and that is if you don't know how to distinguish between an independent and a dependent clause. That is
Right.
not something that can be taught entirely scientifically. So Joe Burton is amazing at that. I don't know how he does it. Like, I just, bang my head against the wall trying to figure out how to do independent and dependent clauses. But often, a couple of sessions with Joe Burton, and they've really gotten that down in a way that there's no way that could have ever been taught using these formulas. So yeah, I mean, we really do operate at that level of detail with the very important caveat that it's important to recognize that the definition, like that these questions don't have a sort of essence or ontology. Like, they really are. They can be taught in a lot of different ways, and they can be taught in ways that I mean, a student who's stronger visually might be better with a number line, whereas a student who's not as good visually, would be great at just working with negative numbers on their own. So algebra can be taught geometrically. Geometry can be sort of taught somewhat algebraically. Maybe Andrew would know more than I would. But, like, so that's the other part of it, is that we always are of course working with the students on their terms, on the terms in which they work best and have learned best, and in which they've been taught and which they haven't been taught, I guess, in some cases.
Got it, Dr. Joseph. Andrew, if you have to describe, your teaching style, or, your philosophy, because you definitely seem to have a certain way of doing it, and maybe, customize it to different students based on, your understanding of them. But if you have to, like, just tell the essence of your teaching, what do you follow? How would you describe your math teaching?
Yeah, not to give Plato too much free advertising here, but I'm entirely Socratic. I kind of, I think, annoy my students with questions. I don't think I'm doing. Ideally, I'm doing very little by way of answering questions. Actually, I actually am quite upfront with my students. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be annoying here for a second. So, for example, I'll write out an equation, a simple linear equation, and I'll say this equation represents, and all I tell them, and I say, I'm going to give you limited information here. I'm just going to say that this represents my trip to the store to buy apples and bananas. So I do 3A plus 2B equals $45. And I'm like, okay, I want you to tell me what all of this represents. And they said, well, A is apple, or apples. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be even more annoying now, and I say, what about the apples? How pretty they are, right? How much they weigh, how long their stems are, what country they came from, like, what about the apples? And it's not until then that they say the number of apples, right? Because then you turn to the SAT, and all of a sudden the SAT is more prone to make their variables the rate, right? The rate rather than the quantity. And so and if you're upfront with students actually about it, they're okay with it. You say, okay, I'm going to be, like, annoyingly petty with you now,
Yeah,
and ask you every tiny little detail about this. And so my goal actually, ironically enough, is to answer as few questions as possible. I'll return their question with another question. At a certain point, I have to do some explaining, right? But my first goal typically is for students to teach themselves. Because I
Right.
typically say like, and that my goal is to put myself out of a job in terms of individual student, right? I want them to be able to go and teach it themselves. I sometimes will refer to there being what I call a new concept question at the end of the ACT math, where they're talking about a concept that the ACT knows full well students haven't learned because it's not a particularly useful concept, like lattice points or like HV distances or something like this. And I say, look, they're going to try to teach you a new concept, give you a definition, and they want to see if you can teach it yourself. Teach the concept to yourself, because by the time you get to college, you're going to have to read 400 pages a week, and there's not going to be a chance that your professors are going to have a time to teach you everything in class. You're going to have to teach yourself plenty of these things out of a textbook. And they're not even going to attempt to teach you all of those things. You're going to have to learn it yourself. And so I try to get them to be as independent as possible, and get them to answer as many questions as possible. Easier said than done in some cases, but I don't finish a lesson. If I do a breakout lesson on averages, I'm not going to let them return to the test until I give them 3 more questions where they have to be the ones answering it forwards and backwards. And so to a certain extent, I have to give my students a little bit more credit because they end up doing quite a bit more work in session than I do.
Got it, Andrew. And Andrew, you said, you mentioned that you enjoy doing the one-on-one, the kind of satisfaction you don't get from the a class or group class thing. So, but at the Krupnick Approach, you do both one-on-one and the group class, right? So, do you not do group classes, or do you?
We do. I don't particularly enjoy them as much as one-on-one. It's just it requires a different logistical hurdle, right? How do you and one that I
Right.
don't think a lot of schools actually are well set up to solve. How do you take the attention of a one-on-one program and adapt it so that it's actually addressing what a particular group of students needs? Well, that's a data and logistics question at that point, right? Because it's a time management question to figure out, especially take an SAT class. If you've got one group of SAT students and half of them are testing into the adaptive hard module and half of them the easy, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
And so there's more challenges with a group level class. You find that even teaching 2 students at a time it doesn't just double the complexity, it triples or quadruples the complexity oftentimes, depending upon how closely the students are aligned in their strengths and weaknesses. So yeah, we offer kind of a mixture of both, but even there, right, some tutors are better, I think, in front of a group and can manage that better, and that's probably not one of my
Yeah, I was gonna ask that. Do you have a
strengths.
specialty? Okay, he's
Yeah,
only gonna do one-on-one. He's only gonna do group.
yeah.
But
Um,
given that the Krupnick approach kind of, from what you've spoken, you're so data-driven, and then you're trying to kind of solve as much problems and bring them down to their objective levels. Andrew, I know it's impossible to kind of get the efficiency of the one-on-one in the group classes, but how far have you gone? Are you satisfied so far?
it's hard to satisfy me overall, but we can we can break down. Um, we have a lot of data points, and to a certain extent, you don't know if a particular group is going to be a cohesive, effective class until you've collected a certain amount of data on that class,
Mm,
right?
mm.
So we can break down the time spent per question, the standard deviation of the time spent per question, but and get very granular in all of that data. What it doesn't tell you, though, for example, I was looking over some old submissions from a group, and it became very clear when I made a visual of this particular test that the students who tested into the easy module of the SAT weren't really trying, right? They spent about 5 minutes per question, and it looked like they were really, right? The easy module looked like actually performance dipped compared to the hard module. So I'm like, what's happening here? And so
Ah,
it becomes a lot harder because you're now right? When I'm working with a student, I can actually tell how hard they tried on their homework. I can put a question in front of them that they got right to see if they can do it again live with the pressure of me looking at them. And so there's certain things that on a group scale, if we're aiming at truth, right, which I agree we are, it's a lot harder to get there with a group.
Let me just add one thing, which is that I mean, we do both, right? We have a model that accommodates both sort of processes, and I think one of the things that Andrew's getting at, and I'll sort of say a little bit differently, but I think sort of in this sort of similar, but I think it's a similar idea at least, is that really the critical thing is that you have to have a model that's a little bit different, that accommodates groups a little bit differently than a one-on-one. You know, that the individual is the group is not merely the sum of the individuals, and it's not merely a matter of teaching in the same way and taking the average of the individuals either, right? So it's statistically a very different kind of thing as well. And I think it's like we do a lot of work though on workshops, and we do a lot of work with we do some work with classes, and I think the biggest thing with workshops, especially, is that, in classes too, but like especially when we're doing like workshops, is that there's a front end process that's different, that's very different from what you start with with one-on-one. That we spend a lot of time when we're doing a workshop organizing the class, like organizing who's going to be in it and what would be the right group of people,
right,
and the right matching would look like. And so when we're talking with schools, for example, you know, about how to do work with schools and do workshops for a whole class of students at a particular school, you know, the ways in which we break these classes down, we have some very sort of sophisticated methods of figuring out who's going to be in the same class and who's going to be in not the same class, and not simply like whether they're taking the ACT or the SAT, but you know, even like sort of strengths and weaknesses within particular areas. I mean, there are even like personality characteristics and things like that. I mean, I think the biggest thing with workshops, I think one of the big things with workshops is that, or with classes, is that it's very easy for a student to hide in a workshop. And I mean, Andrew, especially the way that Andrew's talking, and I have a sort of similar method, probably not quite so Socratic, but definitely very similar, is that you can't, you know, that a student can turn off their camera on in a workshop, and you might not even notice if there are 20 people there, right? Where a student cannot participate at all unless you're very, very, very attentive. Whereas they are sitting there and you're asking them the question one-on-one, and they have nowhere to run. If someone walks away, you know, and goes to the bathroom, and you're not going to stop the whole class if it's a group of 20 people, but the whole class would be stopped if it's just one person. So like, I think that there's a level of attention that really, you know, we need to have with workshops, and we have to be especially attuned to make sure that everyone is staying engaged. And it often comes to be the case that, you know, combination of even with schools, you know, that schools will work with students, and then they will, you know, in a workshop, and then they will come and do one-on-one work with us as well afterwards, and so you can kind of combine them. But I mean, I think we are very effective at workshops, and we have a different model for workshops. But I agree that they all require a very different kind of set of skills. And we want to be very, especially, I mean, schools cannot be picky about this. I mean, whoever decides to sign up for a particular class, I mean, you can't control that, right? Whereas in this, like, we're really from the beginning setting an eye in a group setting to making sure that these are kids who will flourish together, to the extent that you can know that in advance or make that happen.
Got it, Dr. Joseph. We've got about 6-7 minutes left. I haven't even got to half my questions, but I'll just probably pick one to conclude this. Do you see? I mean, do you fantasize about having your own academic school of some sort? You know, which is just not test prep, Dr. Joseph?
Envision, yeah, fantasize. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, and we've talked about that. I've talked with Andrew and I've talked about that. We've talked
Oh
about
wow, okay.
other members of the team. Um,
I'm not surprised.
yeah, I mean, I think that we're in this weird place in education right now where the ways in which we were taught things, the ways in which the skills that at least that we talk about, and Andrew and I are not even that close in age, but we're close enough in age that the ways in which we were taught, math, and the ways in which we were taught language and reading and the kinds of books that we read, the kind of books that we read in high school, were relatively similar. And they're reading very different. They're reading really, I mean, not across the board, but in a lot of the schools of the students that we're working with, they're reading very different stuff now. And so, these days, it appears that you can go to a very progressive, very, very highly regarded private high school and graduate from high school without having ever read, without having ever really read Shakespeare, without having ever read Faulkner, without ever having read Twain or Dickens. I mean, that's somewhat of a surprise. And you can do with it what you want, and you can be critical or not critical of it. But I do think that some of these skills that, especially the ones that Andrew was talking about around around questioning things, right? Questioning students, but also being having a little bit of epistemological humility, right? Like that even in math, right? Even in math, there are many ways of doing things. There are many ways of getting to an answer, and you need to know some of the basic foundations. Like it's I think some of the schools are having trouble like teaching students how to write, right? Like so you got to teach students the basic 5-paragraph form. But it's like in jazz, right? It's like Jimi Hendrix, right? It's like playing the guitar. It's like in any sort of thing where once you learn some of the basic skills, once you learn the basic rules, to come back to the rule idea, there's a lot of room for sort of being extemporaneous. There's a lot of room for creativity. When Jimi Hendrix is playing guitar with his teeth in Monterey in 1968, I mean, he knows how to play the guitar. It's not that he's doing this because he's already mastered the basics, right? So this idea, in other words, is that there's a way in which you're teaching in which you're encouraging students to be skeptical of traditional methods. Once they've learned the traditional methods, you don't teach them to be skeptical at the beginning, but you teach them to be skeptical of ideas and what they hear, and to be thoughtful about it, reflective about that, and to arrive at their own ways of thinking about things that are things that are informed, right? And that developing that kind of critical thinking faculty, that kind of independence of mind sort of quality, is something that really does amount to thinking about a new school or a school idea. I mean, we sort of we integrate that into our programs, but of course that's not the raison d'être of the programs, but it is something to think about a little bit for teaching in the school. I mean, maybe that down the road certainly would be something that would be an idea. And I think the idea would be you learn the skills, you learn the basic skills, and then you really encourage sort of certain kind of philosophical skepticism or epistemological humility or whatever you want to call it, to encourage people to be skeptical of particular viewpoints, or to disagree, right? To debate with each other about those viewpoints. Not disagree, but just to be open, right? To be open to different possibilities, and to try to think through things, in their own ways that they find to be most effective and most useful. So, yeah, sure, definitely, absolutely. I think there's a need for that. I don't know. There's a need for some new ways of thinking. There's a need in higher education for that as well. Like I think there's a similar phenomenon, going to universities now where you don't read a lot of the classics, and that's fine if you're reading things that are really encouraging you to have to learn how to think. But like learning how to think and learning how to think critically, I mean, which again turns out to be it's a bit of a platitude, but it is really, learning. It's really, it has to continue should continue to be the sort of abiding function of a college that's committed to the pursuit of truth or pursuit of ideas. And it's a little bit, sorry, I'm going over it, but like there's a little bit of, there's a very practical, pragmatic sort of side that colleges and high schools have taken on, especially colleges, and I think to a large extent this is sociological discussion, but like to a large extent, I think people are thinking more about the monetary value and the pragmatic payoff from a college education than they were, say, during my generation. And I'm sure a large part of that is that college is a lot more expensive than it used to be. So in order to justify college, you have to sort of be thinking in terms of return on investment in a way that you didn't have to before. But colleges themselves, in conjunction with the world, with society, could go a long way, I think, by sort of taking a little bit of the pressure off of the practical side of college. Kids can always go to business school. Kids can always get advanced degrees in math.
Right.
Degrees. I mean, you're getting out of college when you're 22. Most people have no idea. Even if you thought you knew what you were going to do at 18, most people don't. I mean, 2/3 of people change their major and that sort of thing. So, I think that having that sort of openness in college as well is really going to be important.
Got it, Dr. Joseph. Yeah, I think you did pretty well to say whatever you said in like 6 minutes or 5 minutes. We've arrived at the end of our scheduled time. So, Dr. Joseph and Andrew, it was an absolute pleasure talking to you guys. And in the hindsight, it feels like, okay, I should have actually gone to have separate episodes with both of you, because we could definitely go on, because I came into this episode hoping to have a lot of discussion around the standardized test itself, and other stuff about how the systems are and stuff like that. Probably, maybe I'll propose to you another episode, and if you're available, we can do that sometime in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
This has been a lot of fun.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Before we leave, I'm just going to stop the recording. Please don't leave.